All right, welcome back. So this is our last video for this week. And in this video, I want to work through some examples that sort of demonstrate how we could apply standpoint epistemology, help us think through the application of this idea. The first example that I want to look at is the first example that Toole gives us, the example of her experience with colorism. So Toole defines colorism as discrimination against or preferential treatment of certain people because of their proximity to whiteness. So the idea is that there is a preference for lighter-skinned to darker-skinned black people. A history, for example, of using bleaching creams to lighten one's skin, to using hair straightening products to straighten one's hair, achieving closer proximity to the beauty ideals of whiteness was seen as attractive. But it doesn't just go in that direction. There's also among African Americans a tendency to discount narratives of lighter-skinned black people, that they're not experiencing blackness in the same way as the darker-skinned black people in the community are. And so Toole gives the example of when she was applying to an HBCU, and a representative of the college or the university came to meet with her at her school and give her some information about a scholarship that she was going to be awarded. And when he saw her, she was much lighter skinned than the representative of the school expected her to be as a multiracial person. And he gave her the information and was very curt with her and just left. Didn't talk through any of it, didn't really try to sell her on the school, and she was kind of perplexed by what had happened. She'd never had an experience with colorism before. And it wasn't until later that she gained access to this concept, that she came to understand what colorism was, and so was able to go back and apply it to this experience that she had. And she noticed that this actually fits a pattern of experiences in her life. She had noticed, and others have noted, there's empirical research on this, that black actresses are often whitewashed on magazine covers, made to look lighter skinned, that more roles are available to lighter skinned actresses than to darker skinned actresses, that lighter skinned actresses and models and singers appear more on magazine covers than darker skinned actresses, models, and singers do. So there is this sort of colorism in the black community that she finally came to have a term for. And it wasn't something that was always understood, right? It was an experience that people had, people of color had, but they needed to develop the hermeneutical resources to make sense of it. They needed to develop their concepts, develop their language in order to be able to put a label on this thing. And once they have this label, then they can talk about it. Then they can theorize about it, and they can understand what is wrong with it, what harms it does, and they can also understand its relationship to racism more broadly, and to white supremacy. So there's our first example. Let's look at some others, though. The next example I want to look at, the further examples that Toole develops are sexual harassment, date rape, and marital rape. I want to put those in some context. All right. Legal practices broadly, the practices of legal scholars, the practices of the courts, the practices of lawyers, deciding what cases to take and how to argue their cases. These shape what we understand as legal and illegal. They shape the laws of our country, they shape the way those laws are applied, and they shape then our common understanding of what counts as legal and illegal. And these legal practices have historically excluded a lot of people, but in particular, they've excluded women and people of color. We're going to focus on women in particular right now. They weren't admitted to the bar until rather late. They weren't able to vote. They weren't able to get jobs as lawyers. They weren't able to sit as judges or sit on the Supreme Court. They weren't able to be legal scholars, and so they didn't shape legal practice in any meaningful way. Legal practice was largely shaped without the input of women. And as a result, it neglected to regulate oppressive practices to which women have been subject. Right? Women have for pretty much all of history been subject to certain oppressive practices because they are women. They've experienced sexual harassment, date rape, and marital rape, and none of these were considered illegal. None of these were shaped as illegal within our legal system because women had largely been excluded. Their standpoint, the standpoint from which it would have been perfectly clear that these are things that happen systemically to women, was excluded from our legal practices. Right? Marital rape, it really wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that it was recognized that women could be victimized, could be raped by their husbands. Until then, that just wasn't a crime. It wasn't considered a crime because women were largely excluded from shaping what counts as a crime. So let's dig into the sexual harassment example a little bit further. This is kind of a classic example of standpoint theory at work. So sexual harassment has only been something that we talk about, that we recognize as sexual harassment since the 1970s and 1980s. It's not that prior to that these experiences did not happen. Right? Women have always in the workplace experienced unwanted advances by men, unwanted touching, unwanted groping, unwanted sex, sexual manipulation. All of these things are things that have happened in the workplace for a very long time, since men and women have been working together, probably. And we're just taken as the way things are. You'd have, women would talk about these experiences with each other. They'd warn each other about certain men that you should stay away from. Bill over in accounting, don't get too close to his desk or he's likely to smack your bottom. That sort of thing. Protecting one another from these sorts of actions. But they didn't have a label for it. They couldn't talk about exactly what was wrong with it. It wasn't recognized as something that was a systemic problem or something that deserved legal redress. But in the 1970s, early 1970s, Carmita Wood and a number of other women in the Cornell Department of Nuclear Physics discovered that they'd had similar experiences of being groped by men in the workplace. They started talking about these experiences with one another and started organizing to speak out about these experiences. Wood ended up writing a book about these experiences. But in order to speak out about these experiences, they realized that they would need to draw attention to these experiences, that it needs a name, right? They'd need to be able to call it something. So at this point, we've got that women are in a position to recognize that this is something that is happening to them, and men are not in a position to recognize that this is something that systematically happens to women in the workplace. The men who commit these acts don't think they're doing anything wrong, probably. And the men who don't commit these acts don't see that it's happening as regularly as it is. And they would only worry about it probably if it were happening to their wives or their daughters, not if it was happening to anyone else. So they're not in a position to recognize it. They've got their blinders on. They don't have a standpoint from which they can see that this is a problem. But women clearly do see that it's a problem. They're in a position to recognize it. They have, because of the position that they are in the social hierarchy, because of their standpoint, they're in a position to better see how this hierarchy constricts their behavior and puts them in dangerous positions, puts them at risk. But they don't have the language to talk about it yet. They're suffering from what we might call a hermeneutical injustice. They lack the conceptual and epistemic resources to make sense of their experience. They can't describe it to anyone who hasn't had this experience. They don't have language that fits it into a broader pattern of experience. They can't make meaning of it. They can't make sense of it. That's what it is to suffer a hermeneutical injustice. These concepts have not been developed because the people who developed the concepts, the people in the dominant class, the men, had no reason to develop these concepts. The people who have developed the law had no reason to develop these concepts. So the women who were experiencing sexual harassment, which didn't have a name yet, had to develop the conceptual tools. Until they did develop those tools, it remains an obscure and confusing experience for them. In order to develop those tools, they had to recognize the phenomenon and share their stories. And then they had to engage in a process of consciousness raising. Right? They had to talk about their experiences, understand that they are systemic experience or systematic experiences that are happening to women because they are women in these conditions. They had to be able to share their stories, to collect other stories, to be able to begin to theorize what causes this experience, so many women to have this experience. Okay? So they had to engage in this process of consciousness raising, make others aware of their experiences and make sense of their experiences together. And then they had to put a name on it. And it was perhaps this group of women at Cornell who named it, who engaged in this consciousness raising. The name is often attributed to Catherine MacKinnon, another feminist legal scholar, who took up a number of sexual harassment cases, early sexual harassment cases, and started using this language in front of the courts. But now that it's named sexual harassment, the dominant culture rejects this new concept, right? They say, no, this isn't a systematic problem. This is a few bad apples. This is something that, yeah, there are some sleazy men that work in some places and they act like this toward women, and maybe that's a problem and we need to get rid of those guys. But most men don't act like this, and it's certainly not something that happens systematically in all workplaces, right? This is engaging in an act of willful hermeneutical ignorance. The dominated class, the marginalized class, women in this case, have made sense of their experience, have theorized it, have named it, and now they're bringing it forward and arguing that this is something that's happening to us. And those who are in a position of power, who are in a position to change things, say, no, it's not really. I don't think that's actually happening. Right? It's not. We'll explain it away some other way. And it wasn't until the courts started recognizing sexual harassment through a series of cases, dozens really, that are brought in the 1970s and 1980s, often brought by Black women, that sexual harassment starts being taken up as a real problem in the workplace, something that really needs to be addressed. It's not until the courts start saying, hey, will we recognize this as an issue? They only started doing it because the women who were experiencing it started making enough noise to cause them to recognize it as an issue. But it wasn't until then that it started being taken up as part of our dominant hermeneutical framework that came to be a thing that we all understood happens fairly regularly, unfortunately. So sexual harassment gives us, we saw where standpoints matter, and now we've got these ideas of hermeneutical injustice and willful hermeneutical ignorance that go along with this. The last example I want to look at briefly is not an example that Toole gives us, but it's one that is really relevant here. It's epistemic oppression and police violence in Black communities. Right, here again, we have a standpoint issue, right? Black folks, especially but not exclusively poorer Black folks living in urban ghettos, have shared experiences of they have these shared experiences of over-policing, of being stopped for no reason, for minor infractions, being harassed by police, being victims of police brutality. Right? But they lack the concepts to describe this cluster of phenomenon. They know this is something that's happening to them. They know that they need to, they teach their children how to how to talk to the police, how to behave in front of the police, how to be safe when they encounter people in positions of legal authority. They know that they're much more likely to get pulled over by cops than other people are. They're much more likely to get stopped in the street than other people are. They know that the cops spend more time in their neighborhoods and look for minor infractions to stop people for, to search them. These are experiences that Black folks have had for a very long time in our society, and they talked about these experiences. They made jokes about these experiences. They had a language for sharing these experiences with one another, and these are experiences that went largely ignored within our society by the dominant classes in our society, by white folks in particular. But they didn't have a shared language for talking about these experiences. They suffered a hermeneutical injustice in this case because they were in this non-dominant position, and the dominant hermeneutical resources didn't recognize this as problematic. They recognized this as police doing what police do, not as anything troubling. As police locking up bad guys, and Black guys were bad guys, right? That's the way it was broadly understood. So they had to first engage in a process of consciousness raising. They had to develop concepts and hermeneutical resources to talk about these shared experiences and call attention to it. And they did, right? We see this part in the civil rights movement, but really it comes to the fore in Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is centered around these instances of police brutality and harmful policing practices in Black communities. And Black folks are finding a way to talk about these experiences and call attention to them, finding flashes in the pan when young Black men in particular, are killed by police that draw attention to this plight. But then they experience willful hermeneutical ignorance, right? The non-dominant hermeneutical resources that they're developing to talk about these experiences, to share what's happening to their communities, are rejected by the dominant discourse. They're rejected by white society. The dominant discourse, people in positions of power, mayors, police chiefs, police oversight commissions, and courts say, show us the statistical evidence. Show us that these communities are over-policed, that Black folks are more likely to be killed by police, more likely to be perceived as a threat by police, more likely to be arrested or stopped by police. Show us the statistical evidence here. And there is none, because this evidence isn't gathered. Because the dominant culture, the dominant society says, didn't recognize this as an issue. So why would they be gathering evidence about it? Why would they be collecting evidence about this? And so if there's no evidence to point to, the courts and mayors and police chiefs say, well, then there's no problem here if you can't give us the evidence, right? So then they're folks who are raising consciousness, Black folks who are raising consciousness about this issue, are placed in a position of epistemic exploitation. Right? They're told they have to do the work to build this body of evidence to make their case, this body of evidence that will be accepted by the dominant culture. Black activists are made to educate the rest of us, rather than accepting their hermeneutical resources, the way they've developed to understand this experience that they are facing. We say, no, you've got to put it in our words. You've got to put it in the words of the dominant culture. And that's a kind of exploitation, to say, yeah, you've got to do even more work to remedy our ignorance. So again, we've got the application of standpoint epistemology, that Black folks are in a position to see something that the rest of us are blinded to. We have our blinkers on. We can't, or our blinders on. We don't see that this is an issue, and they do. We have hermeneutical injustice, willful hermeneutical ignorance, and epistemic exploitation following from that. All right, this was a little longer than I wanted it to be, but I hope that you find these lectures useful this week, and I'm looking forward to a really good discussion about this issue.